you have to have these difficult conversations.
So the movement is about equality.
That was a really intense debate.
Let's just keep it strictly about facts and we'll be good.
I mean, this is a verbal fight. I mean,
it is.
We invite you to be a part of the league and participate in actually debating.
Can you hear me now?
Good evening, Great Debate League. I am your moderator and host for this evening, Dr. Mutor Flood. We appreciate you for taking part in tonight's debate. I hope that you can stay with us until the end as we rely on your votes to determine who is the greater debater. Tonight's premise: the United States of America is fundamentally a racist nation. Taking the affirmative position is Dr. Bruce Strobel Jr. Dr. Bruce Strobel Jr. is an educator, researcher, and community organizer from Tallahassee, Florida, by way of Pasadena, California. Dr. Strouble is a graduate of Florida A&M University, a founding member of the Citizens for a Sustainable Future, as well as a senior fellow at both the Institute for the Polarities of Democracy and the Environmental Leadership Program. Dr. Strouble serves on the board of directors for the Moving Forward Network and Rethink Energy Florida. Much of his advocacy and research focuses on mitigating the impacts of racism to advance sustainability and environmental justice for Black communities. Arguing the negative is Immanuel Lewis. Immanuel Lewis is a Los Angeles, California native. He is also a cryptocurrency consultant dedicated to helping people buy, secure, and earn interest off of their crypto. In his spare time, Immanuel is an avid multi-discipline student studying different challenges that exist in the world and seeks to understand and solve them from a root cause level. Immanuel is a summa cum laude graduate of Howard University, where he had the opportunity to study under great professors such as Greg Carr, A. Wade Boykin, and Kola Ambi-Mabola. Tonight's guiding definitions. 1, fundamentally. That's going to be defined as a founding base, central core. The second guiding definition is racist, which in the way we're defining it today is going to be prejudicial, discriminatory, or antagonistic actions taken against members of another race to establish or maintain a position of racial superiority. In this debate, we have a parameter. So we're going to look at the United States history from 1765, following the French and Indian War, to the present. This is an unranked debate, and as always, there will be no personal attacks of any kind, no profanity, and no interrupting. Both participants are allowed to call a fact check timeout only during one of their designated speaking times. We will now begin round 1, opening statements. Each participant will provide an uninterrupted opening statement. We're going to begin with Dr. Bruce Strobel, arguing the affirmative. Dr. Strobel, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. So I'm certain that many of you watching this video are well aware that the United States is and has always been a fundamentally racist nation. However, many of our right-leaning brothers and sisters who value patriotic zeal above humanity continue to make the argument that somehow America is not a racist nation. They will argue that racism is merely the series of isolated acts or of a few bad apples or individuals. In some cases, they may even try to persuade you to believe that all racism took place in a vacuum in the past and then magically disappeared in 1965, a few years before Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So I took this debate to do my part in fighting against racism by eradicating racist ideas. This idea that the United States is not fundamentally racist is in itself a racist idea. I'll start with a brief historical review. 13 British colonies in the late 18th century first began to consolidate their cultural identity around this idea to protect this institution of whiteness. The thirst for more land to expand white economic and political power at the expense of indigenous Americans and African captives was among the driving force behind the formation of what we now call the United States of America. Fast forward to the Constitutional Convention, in which only white men were allowed to participate in the formation of the nation's organizing document. How else do you think they came up with the 3/5 compromise, or the idea that they could pass on regulating the import of human beings as slaves for a 20-year grace period? I posit that the United States was created to bring about greater economic freedom and prosperity to first white men and then white people at the expense of indigenous and black people. This is simply a fact of American history. However, that's not good enough. I'll go as far to say that the United States has not done a good job at removing this racism. I'm suggesting that an involved and improved virulent system of racial oppression is still in operation today in 2021. So please consider these statistics as we move through tonight's debate. White men make up 31% of the United States population, but they are 65% of all elected officials. 80% of all higher, or 80% or higher of all school administrators, school superintendents, university presidents, tenured faculty in higher education, professional sports teams owners, or coaches, and more than 90% of the Forbes 400 executive CEO level positions. I call this manufactured superiority. It's a social status resulting from prejudicial and discriminatory policies against others, which we've defined as racism tonight, and it's implemented to consolidate power and privilege for white people. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Strobel. And now for Immanuel Lewis, Affirmative. On mute. Mr. Lewis, you're on mute.
There we go. I submit that racism, discrimination, and bias exist in America and within the Black experience. In order to win this debate and prove the premise set before us today, my opponent must display the fundamental causal principle of America being a racist one. This is a steep hill because sociologically, the opponent would have to prove causation. Any serious sociologist would realize that this is not a unidimensional problem. So they would do a multivariable analysis on this, likely a principal component analysis in which you would place racism, sexism, classism, bias, discrimination, etc., all on a continuum. At the end of this, you would only find association, not causation, and thus not fundamental. This alone shows that America was founded on multiple variables, not one thing. Now, this vision of America being fundamentally racist did not exist throughout the time of MLK, and is a recent theory posed by critical race theorists. Critical race theory comes from the critical legal studies, which comes from critical theory, which is the study of the dichotomy of oppressor and oppressed groups, in which there is a dominant force which is responsible for social problems and social inequity. Under this force, or racist system in this case, individual action on behalf of the oppressor or oppressed is not sufficient to transcend social problems and rid society of the original sin of racism. Only the uprooting and overthrow of the system can lead to liberation, not incremental justice as witnessed during the Civil Rights era. The epistemology, or way of knowing of critical race theory in the America is racist ideology, is done through the act of personal storytelling or sharing of experience known as standpoint epistemology, and not through empirical methods or argumentation methods like deduction or induction. The experience, or the feeling of the racist force oppressing you, is what makes it valid. However, what they don't see is how they are still using a tool of argumentation called abduction in substitution for deduction or induction. Abduction occurs when you are using an experience to infer a possible reasoning for why something happens. It doesn't prove causation, which cannot prove fundamental nature. So following this logic, if the opposition believes in the storytelling epistemology of CRT, then what is the process by which he validated and selected his theory and hypothesis over all the other abductive critical theories that exist to theorize America's founding? These theories suggest that America is fundamentally sexist, homophobic, classist, ableist, ageist, etc. He would have to deem them credible as well, since they use storytelling for epistemology, meaning he believes in relativity, that America is fundamentally relative in our account of the nation's founding principles. He must now submit that either all accounts and principles of the nation's founding are valid since all is relative, negating fundamental causation, or he must admit that we can use scientific measurements like sociology and statistics to prove that this statement can at best show association, not causation. I'm done.
Thank you for that, Mr. Lewis. Now we will now begin round 2. This is the lightning round, which allows for an open cross-examination between both participants to engage in interrogation of their opponent's position. This is a shared time frame for both debaters. Audience, please listen carefully and pose your questions for our debaters, as audience Q&A is the next round. This round is 15 minutes. You may begin.
Hey, Bruce. So just like I said, man, like I'm struggling with your epistemology. Do you subscribe to standpoint epistemology for your premise?
No, you heard my premise. Fundamentally a racist nation. And I thought your opening statement was clever, and you tried to slip in a trick to kick the goalpost down and say, I need to prove absolute causation, in which I can demonstrate causation of a lot of the disparities faced by people of color today directly resulting from policies created by the United States government or by different states or different actors or agents on behalf of the United States. But that's not necessary. That's just one more example of structural racism being in place. So again, let's stick to our definition and our terms for the debate. From 1765 forward, has the United States been structured in a way in which it has done what we defined as racism, which is antagonism, discriminatory practices, or prejudicial practices for the purpose of maintaining superiority. And I go back to the Constitution of the United States. They wrote into it a way to count African people so that they would not be given full representation in the government.
That's not true, dude. That's not true.
How is that not true?
That's not true. Okay, so are we talking about the 3/5 compromise right now?
Yes.
Okay,
how would you articulate the 3/5 compromise, sir?
Okay, so if you look, for instance, right, of all of the presidents between the years 1800 through, up till Lincoln, let's say 1860, right, and you also, I'm still at the Constitutional Convention. No, I know. I'm going to back into that. What you recognize is that there's only 3 presidents within that 60-year period that was from the North, right? And then you'll also note that most of the Supreme Court justices had like a 7-2, 8-1, 9-0 advantage because you had Southern presidents picking these justices. At the Constitutional Convention, you had the North who said, we don't want the slaves to have any representation in the count for electoral processes, but we want them to be taxed.
Correct.
The South said, we want the slaves to be counted as whole people.
Correct.
But we don't want to be taxed. So you had the 3/5 compromise come as a result.
The problem with your approach here is that you're thinking from the position of the white person writing the Constitution and not the black person who's being excluded from the process. So you're discounting them as human beings altogether. And you're saying that, they're deciding that they get for taxation. They're deciding they get for representation. I'm saying no matter how you slice it, they are being excluded. So while you're under this illusion of inclusion, you're still missing the ball. You're missing the point that black people are being excluded from the process, which by our definition, discriminatory practice is racism. And that puts it in the fundamental core of the United States. It's for a forming document. How can you reconcile that?
So you're assuming that, if you know the Constitutional Convention, you know that they didn't even, if you read it, you know that they didn't even come to the Constitutional Convention to deal with slavery. Right, but it kept already given. It kept coming up, right? When they were talking about trade, when they were talking about taxes, when they were talking about everything like that, they realized that they had to deal with slavery. Yeah. And what the North knew is that if they just said, we're going to abolish slavery, we're going to get rid of slavery from the start, the South would not have joined the Union, right? So
you're making my argument for me. So because they knew that the South would join the Union, what did they concede to continue what?
You said, repeat that.
The North, knowing that the South would not join their union, what did they concede?
They had to concede on the representation issue and the continuance of slavery until
Okay,
Abraham
to
Lincoln.
continue. So let's talk about what is slavery, right? This is a practice that dehumanizes people. It allows for women and men to be raped and brutalized by owners, right? These people are African people. So what we see is a disparate impact being passed off to a group of people so that another group of people can form their government and protect their interests. Of course,
you're still not
interests in why you're forming the United States, but the ultimate goal is they're sacrificing Native and Black lives so that they could carry forward their own political interests. This is by definition what we define as racism.
No, so once again, when we talk about fundamental, right? You're in my understanding, a central core founding principle, right?
Yes.
As we define fundamental,
base,
right? I mean, the question is like I mentioned in my opening statement, there are people that would say America is fundamentally sexist, classist, homophobic as well. Also. What you say?
It could be, and it's not. They're not mutually exclusive.
But this is where it gets a little relativist for me, because you have to pick one, right? It can't be.
Not. That's a false dichotomy.
No, it's not. No, it's not. If you're saying if the premise is fundamental, so you're saying that America can fundamentally be racist, sexist, homophobic, classist, ableist, ageist, handicap, liberty-centered, capitalist-centered, iterative, any variable it could be fundamentally then.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I said, so basically you're saying it can fundamentally be any variable that somebody
Not any variable. There are select variables that have been identified. Tonight we're talking about racism. And by you introducing other isms and other systems of oppression, you do not discount that the country is fundamentally racist.
No. I wholly like I said, it's a racism exists, right? And it is a variable. If you're doing sociology, you do a principal component analysis, the P variable will show, whether or not it's statistically significant. You would only be able to prove association, not foundational or fundamental. Right? If you do a study on it, you couldn't prove this.
That doesn't prove it. I think you're taking a positivist approach to it, and that's fine, but that doesn't work necessarily in a sociological argument or in a study of history where we could see policies put in place, and then we could look and study policy impacts and policy outcomes, and you will see that when they do, for example, you look at Bacon's Rebellion in the Virginia colony, and then you look at the after effects and the new policies that come out, and they change the way that they look at people, and they start identifying Blacks as the people who should become slaves in the country. Right. I could do this repeatedly, and what you see is you get this situation of manufactured superiority, where a group of people are given privileges and advantages against the rest of the society, and then that accumulates for a century almost before being challenged.
You're reducing it all to one variable.
I'm not reducing it to one variable. I'm explaining how that variable is a component of the structure of the foundation of the fundamental elements of what this society is.
Did you ever see The Wire, for instance? Have you ever seen The Wire?
Yes, I have. I don't see how that's relevant, sir.
It's very relevant, right? So in The Wire, every season tracks education, the police, politics, all, even newspapers and media, right? And the characters themselves are dealing with very disparaging circumstances, right? There's a system on them. But if you watch The Wire, you realize all the variables that went into Naaman, for instance, being a corner boy, having Weebay as his father, and him going off to college and him having a good life, right?
Yeah. Again, I don't see how that's relevant. But since you brought up The Wire, let's talk about the war on drugs. We could use that as a proxy from the tangent you ran off on. The war on drugs. What are your thoughts on this? You think this was a policy that was applied with discriminatory elements that focused on certain communities?
If you look at the war on drugs, you look at the welfare state and the policies associated with it, it was disastrous for the African-American community.
It was. And so, I know what you're saying. Like, Democrats brought these policies about, right? It was the left that really promoted these disastrous policies that had negative impacts on African Americans. Would you say they were antagonistic?
What is who antagonistic?
The policies, were they antagonistic towards Black people?
The war on drugs and the welfare state? I think so. I mean,
you think so? Did they create disparity? Did they create social inequality?
They created worse outcomes for black people.
Social inequality, meaning that it put white people, or it put black people in a position where white people were able to maintain or gain more economic.
There's a couple of factors that.
Can we pull up the definition of racism that me and the gentleman agreed to? Prejudicial, discriminatory, antagonistic actions taken against members of another race to establish or maintain a position of racial superiority. Again, this is a checkmate situation. But we can continue the debate for good measure. But ultimately, you have conceded now that the war on drugs, fundamental to the United States again. Here we go. Another key policy critical for our situation that we are in today. It's part of what the nation is. This is a fundamentally racist nation. Can you give me a time period where there was no racism in the United States? Name a time period.
You say that one more time.
Can you identify a time period in United States history where there was no racism?
There's many things that have been in existence for human history, right?
In United States history, sir, I asked you a direct question. I will appreciate if you can answer it. If you cannot, say no. And we'll
racism on racism as defined.
Yes.
Racism by individual people.
Racism not existing in the United States at any point in American history.
Racism has been in America, yes, since its history, but also other things as well. Just like I said.
Okay.
Like, I mean, you're saying that there's all these and variables and they can all be present at the same time, and that's its own logical fallacy. If you're saying that if the premise is fundamental, right? That denotes one thing, and it's clearly other claims on the foundations of America, and you haven't wiggled out of that at all. Like, you realize sociologically,
fundamental can be plural. Fundamentals, fundamentally, a founding central core.
All right. How do you prove central?
That's not singular.
How do you prove central or
in the core or something?
How do you prove central or core when there's limitless variables?
I did not agree that they were limitless.
Right. So what I'm asking you is, how do you select this theory over other theories? Because there's other theories that would say that America is sexist or classist or, liberty center, freedom.
They're not mutually exclusive. You keep repeating this and it's not helping you. Anyone watching with common sense will know America can be both sexist and racist. In fact, that's not critical race theory, and we really talk about this concept of intersectionality in critical race theory, where people could be suffering or being oppressed by multiple points simultaneously.
The only way that you know these things, once again, is through the standpoint epistemology, and
it's not through standpoint epistemology. We can measure impacts. We could look.
How would you measure? Name
lived experiences.
You cannot measure it.
Have you ever heard of policy analysis, sir? What do you mean?
Have you heard? Listen.
What do you mean?
Like I was saying, right? You every time we're getting into this, you can't point to any principal component analysis that can show that, okay, for instance, if America is fundamentally racist, then what is the P variable in the racism of America? Like, how statistically significant is it for you to prove that it's fundamental or fundamentally racist? Then you would have to prove that it has
at its core, it has prejudicial, antagonistic, and discriminatory practices for the purpose of advancing white people.
Once again, you haven't proved fundamentally.
You started with the Constitution, sir, which you agreed was they made concessions so that they could advance their political interests. You again have walked right into another defining moment of this debate where you're conceding again that the country is fundamentally racist.
No, I mean the difference between you and I is you're saying that there's, once again, and this is a critical race theory view, you're saying that this racist system, it's like this univariable thing. It's this one overarching thing. What I'm saying is that there's multiple things that are happening here ever since the country's founding. I mean, to suggest that there's only racism since the country's founding, or is the central core thing, is just not right. And I don't know how you would even measure such a thing.
Because the country was founded around an agreement to continue slavery and the enslavement and the brutality and the murder of black people. and
But-
also
but-
land annexation
but-
and
but-
hostile takeovers against Native and Indigenous people.
But if you know,
what do you
so-
mean? Like that is
so-
racism, and the country is founded upon
So,
this.
so
It's
as
not
you
really
know,
something that
as you
people
know,
debate.
so as you know, the country inherited the slavery institution from British colonialism.
That's
right?
even more foundational, sir. You're again making my argument for me.
No, oh, God. Okay, can you name me anywhere at the time that also, like everywhere else had racism, and America was one of the first beacons to actually rid it of slavery and rid the world of slavery?
No, it was not, sir. You are historically inaccurate. America was not the first place to
I
rid
said
the world.
one of the.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I misunderstood what you were saying.
One of
okay.
the. So you haven't proved fundamentally central or
So
core. There's no
when
way you can measure that.
Again, I don't know how this is relevant, but I'll answer your question. When the British and other countries were moving against the international slave trade, the United States, during its constitution, was agreeing not to challenge it for 20 years in its forming organizing document, its foundation, its fundamental document.
I can't respond.
Thank you for that very lively cross-examination, gentlemen. We will now begin round 3, the audience question and answer round. We invite our audience to submit questions for the debaters. Each participant will be given the chance to respond to each question uninterrupted. Please submit your questions below. Now, as we bring up our audience questions, please support our growth by donating to our Cash App, $ The Great Debate League. Also, check us out on our YouTube channel, Great Debate League Inc., and become a member of our Patreon page. We're also on Instagram, and you can subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and iHeartRadio. And now we're going to take our first audience question. So the first audience question is, what are your thoughts on the 1619 project? Question. I will start with Bruce. Go ahead. You have a minute and 30 seconds.
Okay. So the 1619 project is a approach to frame American history by putting the legacy of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at its center. This comes from the anti-racist framework, and you can see how it's being rejected because it goes against what America fundamentally stands for. By trying to depict history accurately and not center it around whiteness, but center it around the various diverse amounts of people who were involved in the formation of what we call today the United States, you will rub up against the white power structure. So even here where I'm in Florida, the governor and various people have kind of come forward in an attempt to shut down any movement of the such. They do not want people casting the United States history in a true light, because it would show that there are actions today are still lock in step with what was taking place in the past. And they don't want that to be revealed because it might hurt them politically. So ultimately, I think that the 1619 project is a strong approach to teach accurate American history from diverse perspectives, not just centered on whiteness.
Thank you, Dr. Strobel. And Immanuel, I would pose the same question to you. What are your thoughts on the 1619 project?
Of America. It's a very controversial piece of scholarship. There's a lot of things that are pretty misframed when she talks about the Three-Fifths Compromise. There's a lot of things about Frederick Douglass that she doesn't necessarily bring in. But framing America in the way that she did, I think, is part of the issue and part of the critical race theory, where we're talking about the white people and as the oppressors, and they're forever oppressors, essentially. What Richard Delgado would say is like, racism is so normative, it's almost omnipresent. Instead of focusing on some of the contributions that we've made in the Enlightenment period, I mean, through 1619 up until present day, with modern engineering, infant mortality going down, life expectancy going up, And all the contributions that capitalism made to the society to have us to have the ability to do live streams like this. I think it's a better way. That's a better vision of talking about America and talking about this country than the 1619 Project.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that answer. So now on to our second question. Is essentialism a unitary concept? Can something have multiple essential qualities? I'll start off with Immanuel with this question.
No, like I said, what Thomas Kuhn in Structure of Scientific Revolutions, would say that if you're dealing with things that could have different qualities like this, he would say that you would pick the one thing that solves the most problems, right? So I think it's helpful for, especially in nation building, where you want a shared identity instead of adversarial identities, to have one essential nature, one essential quality, one essential lens to look things through.
All right, Dr. Strouble, actually the same question. Is essentialism a unitary concept? Can something have multiple essential qualities?
Ultimately, yes. Things can have multiple essential qualities. This is Fridtjof Capra called this the web of life, that organizations, energy, anything is combined of multiple inputs, and then it responds to those inputs. So when we look at organizations and structures, what we see is that they are much like cells in a sense, the same way we would view a cell in biology, and they're responding to their external environment. So there could be multiple environmental factors, right, that cause something to respond the way it does. So when I think about essentialism, I think about it from that point, that something can have a set of characteristics which make it what it is. But it doesn't have to be one thing, as my opponent has tried to present, because that's just not the reality. Rarely are things isolated and finite. Everything is connected. And this illusion of separation is something that conservatives and oppressors use to kind of justify their actions.
Thank you, gentlemen. All right, now our next question. Immanuel, I guess it's directed to you, Immanuel. Would you consider the Naturalization Act of 1790 a fundamental part of the United States? Also, would you consider the exclusionary term for citizenship, white men of good standing, to be racist?
Yeah, give me a second. Let me read this again.
Sure.
Consider the Naturalization Act a fundamental part of 1790. Also, you consider the exclusionary term for citizenship, white men of good standing, to be racist. I would consider it like I've mentioned all throughout. I think. And like I've said since the beginning, right? Like, I believe that there is racism and bias and discrimination and a whole bunch of things within this country and within this country's history. 17 and that Naturalization Act, I would say is, I would say is more of a subcore. I personally see America as fundamentally, all the isms that we talk about, I see it as being preservationist, because people are focused on self-preservation of their, of their dominance, of their group, of all that stuff first. And out of that comes the sexism, the racism, the classism, all of those things. From there, and then I also just secondly would think that America is iterative. So so much of our adversity we've been able to overcome, and that's through the founding documents and the way that this country was set up in a way that you couldn't really do in other countries before America started in the Enlightenment period. Also, would you consider the exclusionary term for? Yes, I would consider that to be racist.
All right, thank you for that, Immanuel. All right, so on to our next question. Since sexism existed before racism, is sexism more fundamental to America? I'll first pose that question to you, Dr. Strobel.
No, I don't think sexism is more fundamental than racism, because as the United States comes into being, both factors are present. There is an active slave trade going on, and the oppression of women has been continuing on for some time. So I think both are rooted into the foundation of what is the United States, both sexism and racism. So I don't think there is a more. I just think that they are both fundamental elements of United States culture and formation.
All right, thank you. I was going to pose that question to Mr. Lewis as well. Could you put that back up on the screen? The final question. Tech support, could you put that question back on the screen?
Okay, sorry, y'all. Mew, we already gave Emmanuel his own question. That was Bruce's own question. So now we move to the closing round.
No problem. Thank you, the illustrious Miss Johnson. Help me out in the background. Okay. All right. So moving on. All right. So we've come to the closing statements. Each participant will provide an uninterrupted closing statement. We will hear the affirmative closing statement from Dr. Bruce Strobel. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. So I set out in this debate to provide overwhelming evidence that will leave no reasonable doubt that the United States is a fundamentally racist nation. You heard my opponent make excuses and try to explain away all the various incidents of racism. He tried to make it seem as if they were not fundamental elements of this nation's being, right? So I want to leave you with a few more facts to make sure there's no doubt. As I share these facts with you, keep in mind the definition we are using for racist: prejudicial, discriminatory, or antagonistic actions taken against members of another race to establish or maintain a position of racial superiority. So consider, we live in a country where people of color are only 37% of the population, but account for more than 50% of those with an increased cancer risk from oil refinery pollution. Is that antagonistic? Does it meet our definition? We live in a country where African-American youth are 3 times more likely than white children to have elevated blood lead levels. We live in a country where, despite the fact that the research tells us whites, blacks, and Hispanics use drugs at relatively the similar rates, whites comprise about maybe 2/3 of drug users and drug dealers, but 1 in 3 people arrested for drug violations are black. A recent ACLU report found that blacks were nearly 4 times more likely than whites to be arrested for marijuana possession. We live in a country where if we have schools where there are 90% or more of the students being black, Latino, or non-white, the spending is on average $733 less per student. We live in a country where African-American students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended when compared to their white peers. And we live in a country where the median wealth of a white household is 20 times as high as the wealth of a black household and 18 times as high as the wealth of Hispanic households. So please understand, I could do this all day, from category to category, across every aspect of human relations over the entire span of American history, and show you repeated evidence of socially manufactured racial disparities. These issues are not a secret. So why is no one fixing them? The United States is one of the wealthiest and most technologically advanced nations in history. If there were a true desire to address these racial issues, it could be done swiftly. So now ask yourself this: why would someone change what's at their core, right? And then consider, why would, with all this evidence, someone continue to argue that the U.S. is not racist? I'll offer you 3 potential reasons. They're either grossly ignorant and uninformed, they're struggling with internalized racism and seeking approval from whites, or they're benefiting from the status quo and they do not want to see the system of racial oppression dismantled. Peace.
Thank you for that closing statement, Dr. Bruce Strobel. And now for the negative closing statement from Immanuel Lewis. You have 3 minutes.
Throughout this debate, I've highlighted America is not fundamentally racist through philosophy, sociology, and more. I've demonstrated that this is a multivariable problem that my opposition has not had an answer for, and America has many founding values. Thomas Kuhn, the famous philosopher scientist, said in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, that the best theory choice out of all theories, and critical race theory and the opposition's stance is a theory, is the theory that solves the most problems. My contention is that when you consider the contributions of the Enlightenment, such as infant mortality decreasing, the focus on the individual property rights, life expectancy increasing, the advancement of engineering, the multiplying of the population, the expansion of the franchise, women's and minority rights, the transfer of economic supremacy from landowners, which was the case during the feudalistic period, to the economic power shifting to the total population during the Enlightenment, and most of all, the fact that the average man or woman today can enjoy the amenities, the technology, and the goods, which even the ultra wealthy did not have access to in just decades prior. My contention is that this vision of America has solved many more problems than the America is fundamentally racist vision. We have endured legislative delays throughout our nation's history, but ultimately we have made significant strides in living up to the fruits of our constitutional principles of equality, which shows that America also has a core principle of iteration. We have the ability to adopt and adapt to new information as the collective gains expansion in consciousness. And though we aren't perfect, we strive to become a more perfect union. I've taken this debate to prove one point, that we have to be careful about critical race theory and some of what the opposition supports. As a community, we have had our pain pimped by phony politicians for years, that on the back end of our support in alignment with their ideologies are destruction. As Richard Delgado, author of Introduction to Critical Race Theory, points out, they are not here for incremental justice like the civil rights. They are about the system change, meaning the complete uprooting of the very Enlightenment strides that I just mentioned a little while ago. And they've made incredible strides already to erode the foundational structures that we need as people to build community, which are families, education, and religious community for spiritual formation. Just take a look at the family. Take a look at the churches since the 60s, which has been the biggest force for social change in our community. They are in a free fall of decline, and we are suffering as a result. So each of us has a decision. Will we allow this erroneous ideology to take the kill shot on our community, or will we be known as an immortal generation that rose to rebuild from the ground up? Will we succumb to the seductive ideology and talking heads that validate our pains to secure our support, but does not bring revitalizing transformation to our community? Will we ultimately dig deep and turn within to the immeasurable prolificness within our collective creativity, our collective will, and our collective strength that has empowered us to persevere through the darkest of nights of our community's soul and make it to the sunlight with barely bruises to show? I end by just saying, done. All right.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bruce Strobel and Immanuel Lewis, for participating in the Great Debate League. As always, we had a very intense discussion on a critical issue, and we were able to learn from both of our presenters. Now, to wrap up this, we ask that you please use our new scorecard, the audience, to let us know how you scored each participant's performance. This is a quick form that should only take you 2 minutes to complete. Please score each debater's performance on the following. First is fact-based arguments, meaning that they provided facts to support their arguments. Second is subject matter expertise, which in our case, which means demonstrated understanding to the subject matter. The third is persuasiveness, meaning using logical and convincing arguments. The fourth is elocution, which we're defining as clear and effective communication. And the fifth and final one is rebuttals, which in our case means addresses the opponent's arguments. Thank you, audience, for watching and submitting questions. We need your support to keep this program running. Please donate to our Cash App so that we can continue to grow. Also, please check us out on YouTube and subscribe. Lastly, please become a member of our Patreon page. Please join us after this broadcast for our post-debate analysis, which will start shortly. Please join. And have a great night. And remember to always speak the truth. Peace, y'all.